to the Talking About Practice podcast. I'm your host, AJ Giuliani, and I'm so excited today to have with us Zaretta Hammond. She is the author of Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, Promoting Authentic Engagement and Rigor Among Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Students. She's not just an author of a book, as she says, and we look at continues to impact the landscape of education, but she's a former classroom English teacher like myself, which is exciting to kind of talk about, and she's been doing instructional design, school coaching, professional development for the past 18 years. She's been on the National Education Reform Organization's National Equity Project, the former Bay Area School Reform Collaborative, and she does work every single day around the idea of practice, specifically in culturally responsive teaching. Thanks again for being on the podcast, Zaretta.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I'm excited to have you on and really see your definition of what practice looks like in your work. One of the things we talk about on this podcast a lot is that practice as a term and has a lot of different kind of uses, right? In sports, it means one thing. In our life, it means another thing. In business, it means one thing. And I just kind of wanted to open up by asking you, how do you define practice in your work and in your life? What does that actually look like?
Yeah, I define practice as getting better, right? The path toward mastery around something that feels really, really important. So for educators or adults, we want to get good at something. And so in order to do that, you need to practice. But I think we have a lot of misconceptions about practice. And similarly, we want children to be good learners and to develop skills. And sometimes it's not just knowing stuff, but it's being able to actually understand it, recall it, and be at a higher level. So all of those are some aspect of this simple thing we call practice.
Yeah, and I love kind of, the simplifying act of getting better, right? But what that actually looks like and around it. So how did you come into this work, right? Like tell us a little bit about your story, what it was like, and kind of how you got down the path of doing this work with culturally responsive teaching.
Yeah, folks that have read my book, I tell a little bit about my story, but for those that have yet to read it, I grew up in San Francisco, and I was, my mother was a teen parent who lived in the projects, but she lied about our address and sent us to the neighborhood school where my grandparents were able to buy a house, predominantly white and Asian community. And every day I'd go home and I'd see this kind of gap between the quality of education that was happening in these two communities that I was shuttling back and forth across. And so it really kind of lit my equity fire. I didn't know what that word was, but there was something I could tell, even as a young person, that there was just some disparity. Now, what was really interesting is my mother eventually was part of one of the first welfare to work programs, and they gave her the position of library technician. So my after-school program was to come to her library branch in San Francisco, and she would pile the table full of books. And she says, when you hit the table, it's time for us to go home. So I remember going through all the books. I mean, is that the best daycare situation? And I just fell in love with books. I fell in love with words. I fell in love with reading. I remember the day my mom, I asked her if I could go over to the adult section because I had read everything in the children's section and had just consumed all the new arrivals. And she gave me the kind of the side eye, like, I know what's over there in that adult section. But the reality is she acquiesced and allowed me to start perusing the stacks. And I discovered, astronomy and philosophy and mythology and science, and was able to kind of feed my own interest and curiosities, and just really started to fall in love with books. Leap forward when I really started to think about education as a path for me. Literacy was my area, and I taught writing when I was in the classroom, and really helping students get better at writing. Writing is an interesting discipline because it's not like science where you're covering certain content, or math where you're learning formulas. It is a skill. And I had to learn how to help students actually get better. But it meant I started to understand something, that only the learner learns. So that, part of what I understood, and not just my desire to learn, but here's how you get better. Here's how you actually level up your skills, your understanding, so that you actually can do deeper work, more rigorous work. So writing, I was a composition teacher when I was in the classroom, and really starting to understand how to help students get better. And the particular thing was writing, but it translated into all other things. And then eventually, because I started to see a lot of students who were not reading on grade level, I started to actually coach teachers and other adults, tutors, parents around reading development, how to help your student become a better reader, your child become a better reader. What are the things we do to help them get better? Not to them, but with them, right? And so, that's how my journey in this work began. So one of the things I want to emphasize, it didn't begin because I said, I'm going to do some stuff around culturally responsive teaching. I think there are a lot of misconceptions about culturally responsive teaching. It is actually a synergetic methodology made up of 4 to 6 really core practices that people just truncate into this, culturally responsive teaching, like it's a thing. So I have a lot of, passion and energy around the way misconceptions and the way we perpetuate that. So I started to see I can use culture as a cognitive scaffold to help my students get better, to build their schema, to do myelination, to help them actually learn faster. So started to actually leverage that, but it wasn't because I set out, I'm going to be a practitioner of culturally responsive practices, right?
Do you have any insight into how you yourself got better? And learned about those practices while you were teaching? What did that look like as a teacher when you realized there was something that you had to kind of build up? What did that look like for you?
Yeah, it meant that I had this moment, right? I'd come out of my teacher ed program and all the techniques, and had taken my methods classes. And I remember sitting with a student, Adam, right? Even all these many years ago, decades at this point, I remember sitting with him and conferencing, having our writing conference. And I could not get him to really understand that he was making these consistent errors, right? Run-on sentences, comma splices, and I could use all the red ink in the world, but he was just like, I don't really understand what I'm doing wrong here. And I had this epiphany that if I couldn't get him to see, not just see the mistake and learn how to correct it, that's what a lot of what we do, but to actually think about his learning moves, that I couldn't help him get better, because only the learner learns. So after that epiphany, I, unbeknownst to me and to Adam, that meant that we had to do some practice. And the way I broke practice down is I needed to help him internalize some information. Yep. Then I needed to help him practice that, right? But the practicing, and I think this is a piece that educators really get wrong, that practice requires feedback. So just doing the same thing over and over is not practice.
I love that.
And unfortunately, too many educators think, let's just keep doing it. But if no one gives you corrective feedback, all you're doing is reinforcing bad habits or misconceptions, right? And so there has to be a feedback loop in there. And that feedback loop has to not just be right or wrong. There are different types of feedback that you have to give. And that feedback has to come in a timely fashion. It's got to be actionable. And it's got to help you see where the gap is, where your gap analysis, where are you on the road to actually mastering that? So if you can't give people that feedback, kind of like GPS, Siri to and here's, and then we go past our exit, she's like rerouting, right? So that feedback, right? She tells us you're getting close. Oh, nope, you passed it. If our young people don't get that, they can't get better. So I knew I had to do that. I had to get, mentors, a group of other educators who were trying to get better as well. So we could be thinking about that. So I could take my practice and kind of open it up and be in conversation and collaboration with others. And so it meant, I had to have conditions that made that happen. Sometimes it's hard for teachers to get. And I think we forget what a true professional learning community should be about, right? It should be getting better. So it was really in the service of teaching writing effectively, not just the techniques, but helping students actually use them and improve, that I started to understand about practice and the need for opportunities for students to do things over, check to see, am I getting closer? And if they weren't, what did I need to adjust? And so practice has a lot of different pieces to it. Here's the other piece I'd say is really important. There's a social emotional piece to practice as well.
Yeah.
Meaning I have to be okay with being bad. Because in the beginning, when we're getting good at something, we are conscious of how bad we are, right? It's called conscious incompetence, right? And at first, we're just unconscious of our incompetence until it becomes important to us. Oh, I can't do that, but I really want to get better. Now, I'm knee deep in this conscious incompetence. I suck at this, and you're probably going to suck for a minute, right? But if we can't emotionally move through that as part of learning, not as some, thing that says I'm bad at this, right? Or I can't get it, or I'm not capable, right? There's so many messages connected to that because we want instant, application. We want instant mastery. So helping people actually move through conscious incompetence is really important. I call it the first pancake, right? The theory of the first pancake. We make pancakes. We've all made pancakes, either as parents or as kids. We've been on the receiving end or the making end. And there's something about the process of pancake making. So, you're making the pancakes. You might have your plate. People are waiting for those pancakes to come off the griddle. Now, here's the reality. That first pancake is just messed up. It's runny and beige on one side, it's gooey, and on the other side it's crunchy and burnt, right? Nobody's upset. The cook says, oh, I need to adjust. Feedback loop. I need to thin out that batter. Everybody's just waiting. Now that first pancake goes to the dog, the baby, the garbage, wherever. And then everybody's like, the good stuff's coming. That we have to reimagine what does it mean to move through conscious incompetence. And I invoke the first pancake when I'm working with other educators, and I encourage them to do that with their kids. Ron Rickard, author of Making Thinking Visible, he says that you have to have social cognitive norms in the classroom. We love our behavioral norms, but we don't have any norms of cognition and learning. He says, one of those would be errors or information, not confirmation of low intelligence.
Love that. I love that. And you're going through this process yourself. You're kind of making your own first pancake, right? As a learner, and you come to this point where I'm assuming, and I don't necessarily want to assume, but you found something that works, right? You have these 4 to 6 practices that are working with kids that you are working with. And at some point in time, we go from doing it with our students to now helping other educators, helping other people in their practice to do it. What did that look like in your journey, going from working with the kids, and you probably were doing both, right? Working with the kids and education. But what did that look like? How did you take what worked in the classroom, those 4 to 6 practices that we talked about, and actually translate that into professional learning?
So the biggest challenge that I saw were number one, conditions. So when I came out and started to do, and you're right, for a time it was, doing both. And eventually I came out of having my own classroom and really just started working with adults. But I found that I was much more frustrated than having my own classroom, because there have to be conditions of practice. So I call it the dojo, right? That the dojo, when you start to think about martial arts, there's a space that people come into, and it's padded, it's set up for that kind of thing. We have very few dojos for adults in their learning, meaning we don't help them getting social emotionally ready for that first pancake, because they feel that they're fearing evaluation. Many don't have coaches who are giving them feedback, so the feedback loop is not there. Many don't have time. So what I ran up against wasn't just how do I take these techniques I've used with kids and use them with adults, is how do I actually, to begin with, find the right conditions. I found very few districts, very few school leaders that were actually creating the conditions. Even what they call PLCs right now.
No, it's like, let's talk about data, right? I mean, that's what most of them are, right? That's it. Let's just talk about it. Throw some spreadsheets up.
That's right. That and the idea that we are actually using some type of collaborative action research or inquiry to actually figure out how we apply this. Because here's the thing, there is a way in which we keep thinking, oh, what are the 4 things you did with adults? Well, the reality is, this is where, even when we talk about culturally responsive, the operative word, the first word we should focus on is not the culture, but the responsive. Who's the person in front of me? So I first have to understand that person as a learner, but I can't get that close, right, until I have some relationship where they let down a little of the facade. So practice, right, getting to the point where practice, and you're recognizing I'm not good as I want to be yet, comes with vulnerability. So the relationship becomes key. How do I get close enough to have some cognitive insight so that I can pick the right tool, so that I can see where you need to strengthen? Your kick is good, but when you rebound, right? So that coach is that second pair of eyes. And the teacher has to be that. The leader has to be that for teachers. If you're just doing walkthroughs and you're just dinging folks for not having something on the board or not, then the teacher gets and starts to believe that there's no practice.
Right.
That this is all just evaluative versus there's feedback for me to get better, that there's a culture of getting better and moving toward mastery. This is how we manage as adults conscious incompetence. We hold each other up. This is why the collaborative inquiry process becomes so critical. I see some